just for various reasons, and we'll possibly be sharing it as well. Just to let you know, I have no comfort or knowledge of how to use Teams, so I might have to rely a lot on Cath here about how to do this, because I'm very much a Zoom girl. But I just want to say thank you very much for coming to today's event, which is the first of 6 events, which is going to be looking at the idea of creative history in the classroom. And I'm really excited to be offering this as a platform to really be thinking about teaching and the ways in which we go about disseminating our interests and our modules to our students. The session itself is going to work by us offering a bit of an introduction as to why we've decided to do this creative history theme, particularly around the classroom and our personal journeys into that. I'm then going to outline the workshops to you, because this is, as I've already said, just the beginning of a wider sort of platform for us to be able to explore this issue of creativity. And it was really exciting when we did the call for paper, because we were able to get a number of people to come in, both within history, but also more broadly outside of history, as a way of thinking about this teaching and learning in its how it's broadly defined. But also really, I think it's great to see how kind of multidisciplinary this series is, as we've had a number of abstracts from outside of history, but people who are teaching historically informed modules. And I think it's a great way of thinking about these more creative conversations that we can be having around teaching and learning. We're going to kind of offer them a kind of introduction to why we're interested in our creative approaches. And we've got 2 brilliant papers, and I'm really pleased that Brandon was able to accept my invite to be able to participate and really to kind of kickstart this series, because whilst I think it's fair to say that Cath and I are very interested in the idea of creativity, we're not researchers of creativity, and I think this offers a really interesting lens to think about kind of the ways in which we can perhaps move beyond the idea of creativity as just artistic expression and interpretation, and perhaps being more au fait with how we can talk about creativity within a humanities subject that is obviously so word-based. And then we're joined by Jamie, who's going to be offering us a paper about student experiences, and I'm sure there'll be some very honest reflections about kind of how students define and engage with creative methods. The way that it's going to work is we want to offer both speakers the opportunity to have questions to their actual paper, and then we'd also like to have some a group discussion if you're able to. But one of the things we thought that we would do, because we've obviously got our teaching and learning hats on, is providing you with the opportunity to perhaps to start this by doing some self-reflection on creativity itself. And so we've got some questions ready for you as we move forward and think about creativity. So I'm just going to share in the chat function the Google document, and hopefully this is when you'll all be able to access it, and I won't have comments like I can't access it like I normally get with students. But really what we wanted to do was to initially start off by thinking about how are we defining creativity in the classroom, and what appeals to you about creativity, and maybe what the challenges are that you're facing around the idea of creativity. So just to give us some mind-setting kind of self-reflection moments, perhaps sort of like a couple of minutes, if I could just ask you to either reply in the document, or alternatively, if you can't open the document and there are any issues, then please feel free to put them into the chat function. And thank you. And it's kind of really cool because I'd kind of forgotten that everyone gets an animal. That you become so anonymous through animal culture.
I think my favourite is Anonymous Wolverine.
Not to just jump in here, but I've had to Google what an ifrit was.
Are you able to tell us?
Not really.
It's a mythical creature popular in the Final Fantasy games.
Oh,
It's like a
thank you.
fire demon.
Thank you. Okay, I was like, I have a picture of it.
Just imagine like a bull that's on fire coming out of like hell or something like that.
You can imagine that some people have had some really great kind of like adventures in trying to figure out names. So if I could just ask people to sort of finish what they're writing and then we'll come together. So for anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Lucinda Matthews Jones Lucy, and I'm a reader in Victorian history at at Liverpool John Moores University. And it's probably fair to say that if you've been following me for a while, you probably know that around summertime in the second semester, I always get really excited about the fact that I'm going to be marking creative assessments with my students. And this is an assessment model that I've been doing for the last kind of 8 to 9 years, which has been really about trying to get students to think about how to creatively communicate their history learning to me. And I really like it because I think it's a great way of them sort of like getting a bit geeky, because I think the classroom is all about being slightly geeky at times, and showing really kind of wider interests and actually kind of admitting that students come into our learning environments with more skills than perhaps we give them credit for. And so I've always been really surprised by the sort of innovation of this. And, you know, I put my hand on heart that I think if I was given this assessment as a student, I would have probably really panicked to think about what I was going to do with them. But I've had amazing board games. You can also see here an interactive children's book. And I've also used the term creative to get people to think about writing as though they're from the past. So this is a Liverpool brothel guide from some of, and this is just a snippet of some of the resources and creative assessments that I've been able to mark. And I must admit, when I started off, I never realised I was going to have so much work that was teabagged when I designed this module. But I think for me, as an individual, I've been really keen to try and think a lot more about how we create inclusive learning environments. And that sense of being inclusive has really made me, as a neurodivergent scholar, perhaps be a bit more questioning and a bit more inclined to think about how to dismantle our obsession with the written word as a way of thinking about communication. And that's not to say that we're not using words when we're doing our creative assessments, but more to think about actually the diversity of communication and actually the ways in which we can create different tone, voice, and sort of narrations of what we're doing. As I've already suggested, I'm a neurodivergent scholar, and I've increasingly started to think far more about how these assessments are more inclusive actually to staff members who are perhaps not necessarily neurotypical or necessarily kind of want to actually mark loads and loads of words in an intense period. And so for me, I've always been self-reflective around this idea of how do we link together teaching and creative spaces. And we perhaps do this far more than we give ourselves credit for when we are devising and creating seminar activities. And also I think we've sort of moved away from perhaps some of the more traditional models of learning. Cath and I both come from the University of Manchester, where basically we were pretty much taught by, you talked about your article for 30 minutes, you might do some primary source analysis work in the classroom. And that was pretty much it. I think there's so much more diversity. And that's partly because I want students to start taking ownership of their assessments and of their classroom experience and learning. And rather than imposing, I'm trying to push against the grain of what I think a classroom experience should be, in which the lecturer is always kind of centered, and perhaps the students can take more risks and vulnerability in learning through creativity. And it's interesting to see that increasingly people are starting to talk about the idea of creativity as a way of helping with mental health issues and well-being, and also a way of enabling students to create effective relationships with their peers, for instance. So I'm just going to pass on to Cath. Oh, that's just 2 other examples from my creative assessment model.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Cath from the University of Derby. I'm senior lecturer there. I've also got a very bad cold, so apologies for that as I speak. So from being a PhD student, really, I realised that I really enjoyed collaborating with artists. And actually, artists tended to come to me because they'd read something that I'd worked on, and they were also sort of interested in a topic, rather than me seeking that out. But I realised recently that the sort of work I've done with artists has been the most enjoyable of my career. And actually having those conversations with them has made me think about my research from different approaches and angles that I would never have got from in other ways. So just one example here on the slide is I got really obsessed with the history of newsagents, and an artist got in touch with me who was he's an architectural illustrator, and he was putting on an exhibition of independent Glasgow newsagents, the interior and exterior. They're incredible drawings actually, but he actually asked me if I would write text for the exhibition, and we also produced a newspaper, an actual newspaper as a catalogue that we gave out at the exhibition. And it was really incredible actually to think about that sort of different way of communicating my research. It was still writing, but thinking about it in a different way, and how I would communicate that. So I've been thinking much more about creativity in terms of my own research rather than my teaching, really, up to fairly recent times. And there's also a more, can I just double check? Can you see, is it the slide gone on? No, you have to do it for me, Lucy, sorry. So hopefully you can see a bee now. I have been also, during the pandemic, I took up lino cutting and lino printing. And what I really loved about that is that I got in touch again with sort of a sense of creativity that I felt I had lost in the process of becoming a scholar. I'd sort of taken it, put it to one side. But for me, what lino cutting and printing has done has made me think about the process of creating, and thinking about the sort of different choices you make, the different processes that you have to go through. And for me, it's not about the end product. It's not about how good it looks. It's about the process of doing it. And this is purely a hobby. So this was some blackbirds that were in my garden this summer, if you can move on. that I sort of documented with through printing different layers of print, but also you can see there I started to draw them as well. I'm really bad artist. I'm not at all trying to say that I'm really good, but in a sense that's kind of the point. I'm doing it for the sake of doing it and crafting and hoping to get better. And actually I've also sort of got involved in experimental workshops and things like that, where I've just kind of had a go. And if you go to the next slide, Lucy, hopefully you'll see my progress. Next to, you see two cats there. One was the first time I ever did liner printing, and the other next to it is a year later. And so just the idea of getting better at something and crafting something has become really central to my mental health and so forth in the last couple of years. And so I was really sad when I was speaking to a group of students on the degree on a module that I teach called History in Practice. I asked them the question, do you think of history as a creative subject? And maybe one or two of them put their hand up. And I was really quite saddened by that, because it was something that I'd realized through my own sort of creative personal practice, that actually history for me is an inherently creative subject. So I wondered about this disconnect between what we actually do as historians and our students seeing the subject as creative. And this has threaded into my teaching in various different ways. And particularly, we've started doing a lot more collaboration with Derby museums, who have a sort of prototyping process that they go through with all of their exhibitions, and taking the students through that creative process and not just thinking about the final mark, the final product, has been really important actually for me to try and sort of reconnect that sense of history being inherently creative subject. So I shall I'll leave it there for now. Sorry, that was a little bit jumbled due to cold.
And so what I really enjoy about being creative in the history classroom with my students is the fact that I've been able to take these skills out into a wider community. And my work with Toynbee Hall has really seen me doing these creative history workshops. And a lot of the reason why we ended up developing these themes was because they knew that I was really interested in creative methods. So I think in some ways it shows you that actually the vulnerability and the risk taking that you can take in your higher education classroom can move quite interestingly into different learning and teaching spaces. I also think we have to sometimes be a bit pragmatic. I think it's interesting that there's wider discussions now about creativity in history. So we've started to see a lot more projects. Even the HRC have been supporting a sort of wider network about historians being creative, and we're being asked to perhaps being creative around our outputs and our dissemination. But actually, when we look at the benchmark that was released in March 2022, we are actually seeing the term creativity being used. And obviously with all skills, they're not usually defined. And I think it's perhaps this is a golden opportunity to take ownership of those wider questions about what we want creativity to look like in the classroom, because it was notable that you can see it as a generic skill, as a purpose of a history degree. Is this an idea of imaginative insight and creativity? They talk about this in terms of perhaps sort of environmental needs, but this idea of responding creatively and with flexibility as well is something that I think actually all our students are doing, regardless of whether or not it's just tied to current societal or political or environmental needs. But I really thought it was interesting the way they talk about creative problem solving, and perhaps that's a way into trying to think about why we should be starting to think about creativity in the ways in which we teach. So in terms of the actual programme that's going to happen as we move forward, there's a QR code that takes you to a blog page which shows you the different workshops that we've got. Unfortunately, I had thought that universities would be more efficient at getting their timetabling ready, and I'm still waiting to hear from a few people about when some of these sessions are going to actually happen. But what you'll see is kind of the themes and also the titles of people's papers. But I'm really excited by the programme that we developed. So we've got 4 more workshops happening. The first one is going to be gender and queering the classroom. Then we've got spaces of creativity, which is looking at walking tours, digital mapping, inclusive teaching practices, and also ways of thinking about creative writing and primary sources. Then we're moving on to creative objects, 2 papers from book history, and also one about Japanese manga, comics, and thinking about physical and digital sources. And then our final session is going to be on the idea of emotions and feeling creative. And one of the things I was really keen to do in this platform, because we're at the beginning of a conversation and I think it's interesting that this is about creativity, is I also want to offer the chance of us being creative in creating history manifesto around creativity. And we're going to be joined by a zine maker from Manchester called Celine, and she's going to facilitate a workshop where we're going to ask everyone to create a kind of page that could appear in the history manifesto, and that's also going to be joined with some live illustrations of the events that we have going forward. So that's just us kind of setting up our sort of vision and our perhaps mission around what we want to do and achieve in these sessions. I really hope that you can sign up to some of them, maybe all of them if you want to, if you want to be geeky like we are. But I think this now just pushes on to actually start with our papers.
Okay, so I'm really pleased to have Professor Brandon McFarlane with us, who is Professor of Creativity and Leadership, really great title, at Sheridan College. So you can follow Brandon, and I've really enjoyed following Brandon on Twitter at, I'm getting this right, prof_creativity. Hope that's right. And Brandon has recently edited a special issue of the University of Toronto Quarterly on the creative humanities, and I'll share the link to that in the chat in a moment. So over to you, Brandon. We're very, very pleased to have you with us today.
Okay, thanks everybody. In a second, I've actually sort of pre-recorded my talk, so hopefully our technology will work just like it did at 7:50 a.m. here in Canada. It's about 20 minutes long, and then we'll sort of transition into a making session in which we'll sort of apply one of the sort of practices that are introduced at the conclusion. So please make sure you have some like Play-Doh or Lego, or just a pen and paper, some form of objects that you can work with ready to go. And I hope you enjoy this talk. I'm going to start at about 1080 quality on YouTube. And if you're having trouble with bandwidth or something like that, I can reduce the quality, or we can just send you a direct link to it. So I'm going to request the screen share here.
I've also put a link in the chat to the YouTube in case anybody has any issues. Hopefully you'll be able to click that link and get it at your own speed.
Okay, can I just confirm that everybody can see my tab now? Sorry, I can't see the meeting at the same time. So, okay, so I'm going to play it, and just let me know if I need to go full screen or if it's displayed properly. We're participating in this workshop series due to a shared scholarly interest in creativity and the humanities. This is very exciting because creativity is fundamental to everything humanists do. We create and make all sorts of things. We study how creativity transforms culture. We preserve creative outputs in our special editions, archives, museums, and other repositories. but we rarely identify as creative. And until recently, few humanists explicitly studied creativity. So I'm especially grateful for Lucie and Cath's leadership and all the work they put into coordinating creative history in the classroom. Now, I think it's helpful to share a little ostensibly a workshop series for historians, but I'm not a historian. A decade ago, I completed my doctoral studies at the University of Toronto, where I specialized in urban Canadian fiction. I was interested in aesthetic representations of the creative city and more broadly, the creative turn in Western democracies. The creative turn describes the neoliberalization of art, culture, education, and research to underwrite growth in the creative economy. To understand this broad shift, I had to familiarize myself with all sorts of creativity studies research, authored by urban planners, geographers, economists, psychologists, cognitive scientists, and of course, business administration scholars. I think a lot about diverse disciplines and how they think about creativity and understand it in research and practice creativity. I was also very lucky to join Sheridan College as a professor of creativity in 2015. Sheridan College is an odd place. It hosts globally top-ranked BAs in animation, music theater, and game design, along more traditional community college programming for locals and increasingly international students seeking citizenship. My job is to prepare graduates for rewarding careers in the creative economy by fostering in-demand soft skills. Ontario's college sector solely exists to facilitate career-oriented education, and our funding is tied to graduation rates and graduate income. The more money our graduate makes, the more funding Sheridan College gets. Hence, creativity is much celebrated and valued at Sheridan College. But more than simply helping students get jobs, I educate them about the sometimes harsh realities in the creative industries and provide them with the innovation skills to transform toxic systems. To riff off of Linda Hutchin, my mission is to teach students about the new uses and abuses of creativity, both how to become a reliable innovator and how to dismantle the new forms of exclusion and exploitation awaiting them in industry. In 2015, I started using the term creative humanities to describe what I and some of my colleagues were trying to do and how it diverged from historical approaches. Firstly, one requires a knowledge of the creative turn in order to interpret contemporary culture. The socio-cultural context in which culture is funded, produced, and diffused has radically changed. Secondly, graduates are entering the creative economy. Humanists can play an important role in contemporary higher education by helping students develop the ability to critically interpret socio-cultural context. Creatives need to know what came before in order to create truly novel and original things. And they need to be able to critically predict how an output or innovation might transform culture. When it comes to creativity and innovation, criticality is paramount, and the suppression or misapplication of criticality produces disastrous change. Thirdly, the neoliberalization of higher education has devalued the humanities and other related disciplines that are perceived to lack instrumental value. The creative humanities are partially a response, a strategic narrative, maybe even a script that could be leveraged to better situate the humanities within the new rubrics of higher education. And fourthly, humanists have the potential to bring new scholarly insights to the study of creativity, which to date has almost exclusively been studied via positivist epistemology. Creativity is simply too complicated to be understood solely through methodologies that reduce creativity to what can be measured with current technology. And finally, it was just new and exciting that humanists were identifying as creative and deliberately pursuing novelty in their everyday practice. Creativity produces so many other incomes that are intrinsically valuable, such as joy and community and self-actualization. there was a need to champion the unique ways humanists conceptualized, practiced, and valued creativity. Today, I'm going to share one unique way that humanists approach creativity, what we call critical creativity. To do this, I'll survey scholarly definitions of creativity to argue as humanists professionalize and bring scholarly rigor to everyday creativity. Then I'll briefly contextualize how fostering critical creativity can play a transformative role in any student's educational and professional journey. I'll conclude that by introducing conceptual prototyping as a helpful in-class activity that facilitates critical creativity. Then we'll make some conceptual prototypes using readily available materials. So we're going to cover a lot, but we'll have a lot of fun while doing so. So scholars use the standard definition of creativity, which has two important factors. Something is creative when it is novel and appropriate. Novel describes how the idea or thing is new in comparison to what has come before. Appropriate means the novelty is appropriate for the social context in which it is being implemented. Scholars further differentiate between different levels or scales of creativity by the 4C model. So in the 4C model, big C creativity, and that's capital C, describes an innovation that radically transforms society. It describes a technological innovation like the internet or exceptionally influential creators like the Beatles. Pro C creativity, or professional creativity, describes an organization that can regularly innovate, or professionals who can make a living off their creativity. An example of Pro C would be the Canadian band Nickelback. Now, I hope you've heard of Nickelback, but perhaps haven't heard a Nickelback song. They can sell out arenas across North America, but critics agree their music is a bland iteration of 1990s grunge rock. It is doubtful that artists are or will be influenced by Nickelback, but I'm sure there are many who begrudge or admire their commercial success. Little c creativity describes creativity that is novel and appropriate at an individual level. That means the idea or insight might be novel to the individual, but not broader society. For example, if I've never heard of the Beatles and made a song about a yellow submarine, that would be little c creativity. The term is also used to describe outputs that are made but not circulated in society. For example, I have a little groove box, and one of my hobbies is making loops for dance songs. I never finish a song, and I never share these loops with anyone else. Playing with my groove box is little c creativity. The final scale is called mini c. It is used to describe the interpretation of experiences that are novel and meaningful to the individual. It is commonly used to describe the role of the audience. For example, when I read a novel, I simultaneously imagine the world in my consciousness and draw upon my personal experiences to interpret the text. Mini C is also used to describe the experience of learning. Students encounter ideas that are new to them in the classroom, and their interpretation of those experiences make the knowledge meaningful and applicable. Importantly, mini C creativity does not need to be externalized. It can occur solely in our brains, whereas little c requires that the idea or insight or thing be externalized in some form. So if I were to apply the 4C model to literary studies, it might go something like this. Reading a novel is mini c. Writing an essay about the novel is little c. If that article gets published in a scholarly journal, it becomes pro C, and that article radically changes the discipline or greatly influences other thinkers, it becomes big C. So if we stop and dwell upon the 4C model, we come to a rather paradoxical insight. It seems humanists practice mini C as pro C and big C creativity. In other words, one of the very unique attributes of the humanities is that we bring professional rigor to mini C creativity. You may recall Helen Small's The Value of the Humanities. It was published in 2013. In it, she proposed the humanities apply critical interpretation to study the meaning-making processes of culture. In contrast to other disciplines that are grounded in positivism, humanists apply their critical thinking to interpret complicated things and produce knowledge. My colleague, Alexander Hollenberg, introduced critical creativity into the scholarly vocabulary. He conceptualizes critical creativity as the ability to place an idea in dialogue with socio-cultural context in order to produce new ideas or insights. We do not create in a vacuum. Many aspiring creatives get stuck at the little c level because they lack a knowledge of the creative outputs of the past or they're unable to anticipate how diverse audiences might interpret their work. As my colleague Glenn Clifton put it, the social context of creativity is paramount. There are many more authors spinning their wheels, producing works full of cliches, prejudices, and insensitivities than there are lone creative geniuses who fail to be discovered. Herein lies an alarming contradiction in the neoliberalization of higher education. It is broadly accepted that creativity is an essential 21st century skill. However, educational discourse fetishizes individual creativity divorced from socio-cultural context. There is much research demonstrating that deliberate practice can enhance ideation. As educators, we can help students learn how to reliably generate ideas and introduce them to methodologies that facilitate ideation. We've figured out little c creativity. However, the classes and educational programming that address sociocultural context is eroding. Without a knowledge of history, students cannot determine if their ideas are novel. Without training in critical interpretation, they cannot accurately predict how an audience might react to their creativity. Without exposure to disparate cultures and ideas, they cannot imagine how diverse audiences might interpret or experience their creative outputs. So let's take a look at a racist advertisement made by Dove, a soap company that was briefly shown on Facebook in 2017. It is a 3-second GIF, features a Black woman transforming into a white woman after using Dove. The ad was intended to be inclusive and celebrate diversity. It doesn't matter what color your skin is, Dove will make it healthy and beautiful. The advertisement is neither novel or appropriate. Firstly, it demonstrated an ignorance of the history of skin whitening and a long history of racist tropes and ads in which a dirty person of color is transformed into a clean white person after using the product. Liz Connor published an excellent analysis of the advertisement on The Conversation, and you should check it out. Secondly, it demonstrated an inability to anticipate how people of color or anyone else with just a little bit of criticality might interpret the advertisement. So I'm going to apply a little critical creativity here and assume that my audience of history scholars have the history component of critical creativity covered. You're all experts on educating students about history and how to conduct historical research and analysis. So it makes sense to focus on the dissemination component, or rather, how can we train students to interpret sociocultural context and anticipate potential interpretations of their creative outputs. To do this, we're going to transfer some strategies from innovation management into the humanities classroom. In particular, we're going to practice conceptual prototyping. Conceptual prototyping involves taking everyday things like Lego, Play-Doh, or whatever happens to be around to make a thing that communicates or clarifies an idea. It is commonly applied in innovation contexts for 2 reasons. 1, new ideas are difficult to communicate and understand because they didn't exist before. Sometimes we need new words to describe new things. Secondly, innovation often involves interdisciplinary teams comprising of highly specialized experts from different disciplines, which can present some communication barriers. We can overcome these challenges through conceptual prototypes that express an idea. The prototype might use a metaphor or a story to make an idea more understandable, and different teammates may take turns editing the prototype to confirm that they understand what is being shared by communicating it in a slightly different way or riffing upon an idea. So in a minute, we're going to make some conceptual prototypes based upon today's talk. But for now, I'll just introduce each step and its intentions. Then we'll actually go through the process together. By the end of the process, you will have made a prototype that expresses creativity and shared an interpretation with everyone else that is here today. To be clear, conceptual prototyping can be completed individually, but is often more impactful when people work in teams. Importantly, the aesthetic quality of the prototype is arbitrary. Value emerges from the creation process. So to provide a model, here is a conceptual prototype that I made last week, which expresses mini-C creativity. If you follow me on Twitter, you may know that I make a lot of pizzas that express particularly how I'm feeling about the Ottawa Senators, which is an NHL team. I usually make the pizza pre-game to reflect upon the broader drama that plays out over 82 games, and it's always 82 games because they do not make the playoffs. To express mini-C creativity, I made a Play-Doh pizza with pucks and hockey sticks as toppings. It just expresses how I practice mini-C creativity as much as I can when I'm watching hockey. And to reiterate, the aesthetic quality of the prototype is arbitrary. So let's take a look at the conceptual prototyping process. Step number 1, introduce a prompt that activates mini-C creativity. We will be using the prompt, what are some of the unique ways that humanists practice creativity? Step number 2, take your readily available materials and start playing with different ways to express your interpretation of creativity. Embrace metaphors and puns and other unusual connections. Feel free to draw upon your personal experience or share a story that might be relevant. This phase facilitates little c creativity. Once you have a promising design, think about how it expresses creativity and, importantly, how others might interpret or misinterpret the design. Is the design novel? Is it appropriate? Edit accordingly. Here, we're activating critical creativity by considering the socio-cultural context in which it'll be introduced. What's appropriate for the classroom? What's appropriate for this audience? And step number 4, share the conceptual prototype with your audience. Be sure to contextualize the design choices. It is perfectly fine if the design is idiosyncratic. The presentation will make that context understandable and appreciable to the audience. And the final step is an important one. Celebrate creativity and everyone's contributions to the prototyping session. Impact emerges not only from collaborative learning, but the fun and joy and community building facilitated by the activity. So I appreciate that my introduction to conceptual prototyping was a little rushed. We'll try the activity in a moment, and we'll have a fair amount of time to enjoy the process. For now, I'd like to once again thank Cath and Lucie for inviting me to speak today, and I do hope you find this knowledge helpful. I can't wait to see the conceptual prototypes everyone makes in response to this talk. And if you're watching a recorded creates. Okay, well, there we go. That was the presentation. I'm glad we didn't have a technology fart and that it went well.
Yeah, I think it's really good that it didn't crash at all. I sort of now was sort of very concerned that my pink glitter Play-Doh is not quite scholarly or academic enough. But
well,
yeah.
I got my pink here today too, so. Okay, so do you like to sort of move to like a workshop component, or would you like to sort of facilitate a discussion? I think we can probably do both at the same time. So if other people here are in attendance and you have your Play-Doh or Lego, whatever you have with you, I encourage you just to, as we have our conversation here and Q&A session, to work away on a conceptual prototype of what creativity means to you, and especially as a humanist, how might you practice creativity? And the one thing I like about Plato is that you can sort of break it up to pieces, and you can come up with like 4 or 5 potential options before sort of committing to one, and really commit to that conceptual exploration.
Hopefully people will come up with questions. Just as you were talking, I was thinking about the sort of responses that people had to our questions earlier, and a lot of them were creativity is not an essay. It's not something that's in that linear written form. What I find really interesting is can we perhaps think of, through your definitions that you gave, can we actually think of the essay as a creative process as well, and think about creativity more broadly? Because I think some of our issues around creativity is because we have a very narrow sense of it being something that is aesthetically beautiful or is visual. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that, about, you know, the essay is something that can be seen as a creative process.
Yeah, I would definitely say that an essay is a creative process, but perhaps we don't teach it as such in our pedagogy, or introduce it as such in our sort of broader scholarly community. I think one of the sort of distinguishing features of the humanities is that we have exceptionally high expectations of what a polished article should look like, or a monograph, and it's a lot higher than other disciplines, because other disciplines in the social sciences and scientists, they're rigorous, but they publish a lot quicker, they're smaller, and they're more tolerant to emerging ideas. Whereas in the humanities, everything has to be, immaculate and irrefutable. That's sort of what we're going for. So I say that, like, and writing an essay is a creative process. And if we just sort of think about like critical theory is just an interpretation of something new or a social problem that you encounter. It's that the humanists will just think about it very deeply, do observation, and go through a larger process before they're writing that essay. But a lot of the time that is invisible, and we don't sort of show to students how we do that as well. So even just for like conceptual prototyping or sort of other innovation methodologies, you can sort of definitely use those in the sort of creative process. And I think we should be a little bit more transparent about the difference between what we do in the classroom and what we do in our own practice. Because I'm sure if you're writing an essay, you probably have post-it notes everywhere, notes all over the place. You do multiple drafts. You write like 30,000 words and you end up with 5,000. That's all essential. That's all creative work, but we only sort of see the polished thing at the end of it.
So if you've got any sort of questions, comments for Brandon, or you want to share your responses, please do use the raised hand, whatever it's called, or just put in the chat and we can go from there. I did really like what you said there about the sharing our process, and I think that's really crucial to me. And one of the things that I've been saying to students recently is that they come in so nervous and really wanting to get perfection in their essays, from the get-go, because that's how they've been taught. Really, they've been hot-housed to think that they need to pass everything here and pass everything at a high level. And one of the things that I tell them is, look, I've been doing this for 20 years, and there's a process. You're at the beginning of that process. So if you're comparing your writing to an article in a journal, it's never going to happen in that way. You have to see it as a process, rather than you're looking at the end product. You're not seeing all of the red marks on everything. You're not seeing the peer review comments. You're not seeing all that. So I think that's really important. Does anybody else want to share their thoughts, or have any questions? Brandon? Or is everyone just really happy just doing their Play-Doh?
I hope they're just happy with their Play-Doh. But like, I think the other thing is that at least for me, I have like unusual processes in terms of coming up ideas when I'm doing like literary interpretation. And part of what we're evaluated for is that we're we're trying to come up with novel or new interpretations of a text or something like that. And for me, like, I go for walks. So if I'm thinking about an issue like decolonization, there's some really good public art in my neighborhood. And so I'll go and visit that work of public art and think about how it engages with an issue and its aesthetic. And then I try to use.
I've just seen that Hussein has his hand up and wanted to come in.
Well, I was just going to add into all of this general enjoyment. It was a great presentation. Thank you very much, Brandon. Really enjoyed it. I wrote in the comments that when you're talking about the essays, John Warner, essentially, you know, after his 20 years of teaching, you know, writing English to freshman college, just trying to get rid of that 5-paragraph essay. And again, he echoes the same thing, that actually academics go through the whole sort of drafting process. They get peer reviews, they get support, they get directions of things. Whereas actually students just have a pass fail. They submit their work and they're judged on the strength of that. And they see nothing of the general sort of production that takes place around it, whether that's corridor conversations or emails or whatever else, you know. But I was gonna say about the linear one, because that was raised by Lucinda, I think, mentioned it about the essays. I teach music, so when we're doing things like music production, you know, I sort of try and show them, show the students also that just because your song starts here does not then necessarily equate that's what the song should actually be. So when they've kind of rendered it to a 2-track, to like an MP3 or something, I say, what would your song sound like if it started here? And I just go to a random point and said, what would that be like as your song? How is that different to this one here? It's not the Burroughs kind of cut-up technique, but it's in that sort of similar place, in that because when you use a timeline in a digital audio workstation, it orientates you towards this linear sequence of events. And the problem is, very quickly, being humans, they just get used to the idea of this sequential approach. And therefore, to consider that actually you can take that bit over there and put it here and do this, you have to keep reminding people that it's only decided once you've exhausted every available opportunity, then it's probably the thing it should be. But just because that's the place where you started, that does not then necessarily follow that must remain in place all the time. So that was my observation.
Okay, well, thanks so much. You'll be so happy to know that my colleague Joe Lapata is sort of an educational psychologist who specializes in music. So when he teaches creativity courses, he brings really simple instruments, and they compose songs and sort of go through the process. And that's his sort of form of making that he introduces into the class. So just sort of how, like, oh, we'll make a conceptual prototype of creativity with Play-Doh. He'll be like, we're going to make a song about creativity, you know, with just a little 4-note piano or something like that. There's all sorts of ways of finding you know, any medium could be used for a creative activity. You just gotta find what students like and what you could do in a classroom and how many people are going to be there and stuff like that.
Yeah, but it's also stuff that people can do sort of privately. It's not something that requires an audience, and it's not something that if it's a failure you don't have to share. That's all, you know. It gives them the opportunity, and it's in many ways, you know, like for so many of my students, I sort of encourage them to give license to themselves to just do, rather than sort of seek permission or am I doing the right thing here? And you know, it's that fear of kind of judgment and so on is especially in an era of social media.
Yeah, no, that fear of judgment is really strong, I think. I've just seen in the chat that James has a question. Always good to see James. So how do we help students to see that small c humanities creativity is valuable as a route towards doing creative work in the creative industries?
Yeah, so it's you know, I have a couple answers to that. One is just finding examples when you're introducing a concept that's going to connect with them. So that's why I sort of use that Dove ad, because a lot of my students are marketing students or they're illustrators in their film production. Odds are they're going to make a commercial or contribute to a commercial at some point in time. And they often don't have much opportunity, just the way that programming is sort of siloed in our institution, to explore critical issues in their own industry, just because we sort of have, like, if you're an illustrator, you take lower station classes and you only learn how to be an illustrator. And then your humanities classes are there to make you think about the broader world. And that's where the connection happens, because our students are incredibly diverse. You know, Brampton and Mississauga, where the campuses are some of the most diverse cities in the world. And they want to be able to reach different cultures, and they don't want to produce things that are, like, offensive. Like, they're very committed to social justice and diversity and belonging. And that's how we sort of do it, is just that you start with your personal experience, your ability to empathize with other people through culture, imagine how other people might interpret an experience or experience something. And that sort of exchange is fundamental to your creativity, because it's always constituted in a social environment, right? So that's how I sort of communicate it. And the other thing is that emphasizing process and idea generation. So if we're engaging with a complicated process, it's like, well, how do you represent it? And if you're a photographer, illustrator, or an animator, this is what they think about. They want to think about these complicated social issues and think about how they can represent it in an ethical way. Because, like, most our animation students end up working at, like, Disney or Pixar, where we've got the best animation school program in the world, and we sort of sweep the Oscars every year. And it's really important, like, those skills are highly, highly valued in society. But I guess what I do that's a little bit different is that I sort of explain how that, you know, what is normally perceived as criticality is actually creative. And we can go into it more, but there's more and more cognitive science showing that there actually isn't a difference between creativity and criticality. They're just different types of ideas that we generate, and we actually use the same parts of the brain, the same networks to generate those ideas, which I think is really exciting, because as more and more of this knowledge comes out, it's going to change how we think about the humanities and other disciplines.
Absolutely, that's really, really interesting. I think the idea that it's basically how we're labeling it that's different, rather than the actual physical process of doing it. I think that's really interesting. Jamie has said that he's willing to show his Lego creation for us. So Jamie, if you want to.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to speak in a minute anyway, so I may as well lay myself open. So can you see it?
Yes, we can.
So I don't really know what it is, but yeah, because also I make the students use some Lego serious play sometimes. Don't make them do it. Scaffold an exercise in which they really love doing it, and then they do really like doing it. Anyway, I'll talk about that in a minute. The long thin bits are because of ice hockey, but then the rest of it is actually so it's links to Brandon, and the rest of it is sort of, the colors are about colorfulness and creativity. The stuff coming out of the person's head is like the idea that creativity is something that it's a cognitive act, like on some level, as well as being a physical act. Therefore there are things in their hands, and then the stuff going off at different directions and kind of going up and down, and that bit's looking backwards, are all about it being kind of multi-directional, and like it's about taking inputs in and being kind of open and collaborative, I guess. I'm sort of making this up as I'm going along. I wasn't really thinking this while I was making it, but as I'm sort of doing exegesis on my object, I'm now making sense of it for myself. So yeah, I quite enjoyed it. I'm going to take a picture of it.
Great. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. And that's exactly how it goes. You're playing with ideas, and we could actually make a whole textbook about your model there, because you mentioned, like, insight. So that's when you spontaneously get an idea, you feel good, you get a burst of energy throughout your body, and we can actually, like, measure when it happens. And also divergent thinking, right? So generally speaking, the more ideas you come up with and the more perspectives you apply when ideating, the more likely you're going to come up with an idea that's novel and appropriate. So all those different directions definitely connect with that. And also, you're improving, right? You're interpreting your own interpretation as you go. And that's what Mini-C creativity is all about, is riffing and playing with it until you get that idea and you feel like you've fully explored the concept.
Yeah, I think for reasons of time, we might have to move on to Jamie in a second, but I hope that people have enjoyed that process of doing the prototyping. And as we said, it's not about the end aesthetic result, it's about the process of doing it and thinking about it. But if you do want to share it, please do. And also, I just realized as people that basically live on Twitter, Lucy, we haven't come up with a tag or anything. But if you want to share, I would have a hashtag creative history, and perhaps tag Brandon into it as well, so that we can share the results of this. But yeah, it'd be really nice to see if people are willing to share that as well. So I suppose I just want to thank you, Brandon. We'll be obviously be coming back in sort of general conversation later on. But thank you for a really inspiring talk, and I know it certainly made me think about an awful lot about how I think about basically articulating stuff to students that they are doing, but they don't perhaps, you know, think about it in that way. So that's been really useful. Thank you very much. So I will pass on to Lucy, who is going to now introduce Jamie without Lego, I think.
Thank you very much. So I don't know if you want to set up your PowerPoint. Can you do it? Oh God, this is probably when I need to discover that I need to give you something. Are you able to do it?
Yeah, hang on. Because I was on Zoom this morning, I'm like looking in the wrong place. I think.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Great stuff. Cool. So what I need to do is to go into the chat. How do I get back into the chat if I'm now here? If I click on,
I'm not sure.
If you're sharing your screen, you can't really.
Okay,
but
right.
if you share as PowerPoint, you will be able to.
Right, I've got a link here.
You get what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. If somebody can click on that and tell me, because it's editable, I'd like to know if people
It needs
can.
a password.
Password is create.
Create. Very good.
That's very creative.
It's not. It's the. I think it's fun. Right now, I'll start sharing again.
I'm really pleased to invite to have Jamie Wood talking to us. We know each other fairly well, so it's really lovely to hear kind of like some of the sort of teaching and pedagogical pieces that you're doing. Jamie Wood is a professor of history and education at the University of Lincoln, and this paper forms is a small part of a larger project that's actually looking at students' experiences and perceptions of creativity with colleagues at the University of Salford in their business school. So I think it'll be really interesting to hear what your thoughts are, because I think it would be nice to know the sort of stages of thoughts, because I generally tend to see them when they're really worried and then they're really pleased and excited. So it'd be nice to think more about the student journey. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks so much, Lucy and Cath, for setting this whole thing up and for inviting me to speak. And I really have enjoyed the first hour, because it's got me thinking. I can see there are lots of connections to what I'm doing and what I have been doing, and I really loved Brandon's talk and the questions too. Yeah, and I guess one thing I know Lucy and Cath we're all from the University of Manchester, but I think it's important to stress that our collective interest in creativity is probably in spite of being educated there rather than because of being educated there. And I think that might be something that, but many of us might share in common from being educated in history in the UK in the 90s and 2000s. As Lucy said, this really derives from a kind of ongoing and somewhat on-off collaboration that I've had with colleagues at Salford Business School for over the last decade and a half, really, which derives from my work outside of history. In between doing my PhD and starting my postdoc, I worked at the University of Sheffield as an educational developer, and in that process, I got really interested in online making kind of thing, how people learn online and what the process of making stuff online, how that works, how we can support students in doing that, and what they learn by doing so. And that kind of has informed a lot of the work that I've done since then, as I've become a lecturer in history and gone on with my career. And I think one of the things that I've done at various points in time is collected some data from students, some of which I think can give us insights into the student journey and student history students' perspectives on creativity. So I think that will give us some food for discussion. What do our students think about it? But this has by no means been a kind of full systematic study. I've got some interesting quotes. We've done some surveys, but it's not been published, so I think that's one thing to emphasize. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So I'm going to start today by talking about creativity and its relationship to history. I'm going to ask you to think about that as well. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what creating online might be, and the way in which I've tried to get students to create stuff online. And really what I'm going to emphasize is that what I've asked them to do isn't that creative, certainly in terms of what we've done over the last few years with pandemic teaching during the pandemic. So I think it's emphasizing some of the points that have already been made around actually quite a lot of the day-to-day of history teaching and learning can be creative if you frame it in that way in your own thinking and frame it in that way for the students. And then at the final part, I'll talk about student perspectives on creativity. What have they said about this? So when I saw Lucy's and Cath's slides, I was like really worried because I don't feel like I'm particularly creative myself, and that what I've asked the students to do perhaps doesn't seem as creative as what Lucy's students have done, which is actually make stuff and physical things that look beautiful in many cases. But I feel like that doesn't, as I was thinking, I don't think that matters so much, because when I thought about it, I think the key thing is that what I've taken away from it is that it's the day-to-day of doing history. What I've essentially done is digitize things like source analysis exercises and stuff like that, and thought about how students might produce those in ways other than a kind of essay format. And I think that when we think about these, the kind of more traditional approaches, perhaps, whether they're online or not, we can start to see that there are elements of creativity in them. So moving into this first, I mean, increasingly over the last decade and a half, what we've seen as creativity is something that's been emphasized increasingly as a desirable attribute of higher education graduates, really irrespective of discipline. And we can see that in what Lucy, I think, showed when she was showing the revised QAA benchmark statement, which has several references to creativity, which I think, if we were to look back, wouldn't have been found in earlier iterations of that statement, certainly not as explicit. But I think it's what the challenge really for us, I think, is thinking about where does creativity sit in disciplines that aren't traditionally considered to be creative, so non-creative disciplines in inverted commas, and I'm going to kind of question that idea, which creates a number of challenges for us around things like pedagogy, around stuff like assessment and quality assurance, and really around the culture, the broader culture within history and higher education, how we think about ourselves and what we get our students to do, and what the whole point of this is. So what I'm hoping that people will do now is be able to access the PowerPoint slides and be able to take one of the colourful post-it notes that I've created, which is simply a kind of text box, and add some thoughts onto this slide. How does creativity relate to history for you? What's creativity got to do with history specifically? And I'm just looking for keywords or short phrases. This will only take a minute or two. Just want some thoughts. I'm just going to stop presenting so I can actually see what people might be writing.
Did you say that the password was creative?
Create.
Create.
It should be. If not, I can just redo it all over again.
Yeah. I'm
Excellent.
in. Some people are saying it's read only.
Is it? Share. Anyone with link? Set password.
You just need to switch the other settings from Can View.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So if you go into the other settings there, it's right underneath it.
Down here.
A little bit higher, 2 lines up. There you
And
go.
edit. Perfect. Thank you. That was really helpful.
I'm glad to see that I'm not the only person that has problems with sharing these types of documents.
It has just come from a lot of bad experiences.
Yeah, that's working for me now.
Perfect. And I've got some spare post-it notes on the next slide if this becomes too cluttered, which doesn't appear to be a problem right now.
Oh, I said that it was working for me, but it still says I don't have permission.
I think you have to share the new link. I think a new URL was generated with share permissions, with edit permissions.
Right. Anyone with the link?
And then I
Apologies.
think you just got to copy the new link. Sorry.
And edit. No, that's perfectly fine.
Can I make an observation? Because I've had something similar to this before. Because it's hosted on the University of Lincoln's website, unless you're a member of the organization, the federation, you generally only seem to have viewing privileges. I have a similar thing at the University of Westminster. So when we use our SharePoint and those kinds of Microsoft online kind of tools, you can't go beyond viewing. You can't go into the document and edit it. We can download the document and then edit it ourselves, but we can't do it together.
Shall we just shift to doing it in the chat? I'm very happy to do that, which I think might have been the best solution in the first place.
I hope you don't mind me butting in.
Fantastic. Yeah, so let's shift to being in the chat, and I'll start presenting again in a second once we've done this exercise. So what does how does creativity relate to history for you? And I know we've had some thoughts about this already, but we can build on those, I think. So we've got enhance, creativity, crossovers with public history, critical thinking, imagination, making choices within limitations, enhance understanding, that makes more sense, developing empathy, Canadian aesthetic approaches. They thought history through modes like tragedy and romance, that's great. Can highlight how the past is messy, because I guess the process of kind of creativity can be messy. Thinking differently, problem solving, I think, is a key one, and I think that relates to what we were talking about before in relation to kind of critical thinking. I think problem solving is another thing to add there. Telling new stories, seeing the past through contemporary lenses, sensitivity, moving beyond known facts. I think that's a great one. In a way, it can make the past feel more real. Right, this is great. We need to download the chat if possible afterwards.
Yeah, I'll definitely do that.
Alternative kind of, I guess, sources and ways of experiencing the past from James there. That's really great. Engaging students. That's brilliant. Okay, and people can obviously read back through those. So let's continue with my presentation, and the next time we have an activity like this, we'll just go straight to the chat and save some time. Escape my share. Right. So I think when one of the things that I've done is certainly nowhere near as much as Brandon, but I've thought a little bit about creativity in the creative disciplines. And I think when I looked at that and thought about it from the perspective of a historian, I thought that a number of those features of creativity and how it's taught aren't that different if we turn our minds around to how history is taught, or at least can be taught. I think that perhaps the most different is an approach to assessment that focuses on process over outcome. I think history is quite focused. Historians in general are quite focused on the idea of the essay or the exam as being a product. That is the thing that's assessed rather than the process. I think creative disciplines are much better at thinking around open-ended, student-defined forms of assessment, thinking about things like reflection, negotiated assessment, where students and staff are kind of talking to each other about how assessment might work. And I think like keywords, theories around assessment as learning, authentic assessment, where the learning activity and the assessment are aligned with one another and incorporate things like group work, problem-based learning, and portfolio-based assessment are by necessity in a way more authentic, more perhaps attuned to assessing creativity and being supportive of the creative process itself. But all of those things are present within history curricula in the UK. Many of them are present within my own institution. They're just not particularly prevalent. One of the so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the sort of theories that I've found useful to think through this, and some of the themes that come out from doing it, some reading around this idea that creativity is something that should be novel or original really comes out repeatedly in the literature that I've looked at, but also comes out when we've asked students, and we'll come to that a little bit later. And another scholar that I found really useful, from it's now over a decade old, is Baxter McGolder's idea of self-authorship, which is this idea of inculcating in students the ability to question trusted authorities, move away from kind of accepted ways of viewing the world, trying to explore multi-perspectivity, and therefore building their own kind of beliefs and values. These are exactly, I think, the sorts of things that we're aiming to achieve through history education as encapsulated in the history subject benchmark statement. So that those ideas of self-authorship, which are kind of connected to things like creativity, are also intrinsically, I think, connected to what we're trying to achieve in history. Here's just two more that I came across, and I was very lucky when I first arrived at the University of Lincoln, in that it had a kind of institutional kind of pedagogic approach, which was called student as producer, which was really encouraging us all to focus on the role of the student as a collaborator in the production of knowledge. So working together in a creative way with students so that they can kind of design their own learning was really something that was being encouraged at least when I first got here. And I think that's been a powerful means for me to think about what I want students to be doing, or what I want to help students to do, whether they're online or offline. To what extent am I enabling them to sort of produce knowledge, produce learning, produce understanding for themselves, rather than it being something that I kind of do to them. And I also I've done a little bit of reading around sort of like how creativity relates to play, and I think play is really an interesting thing to look at as well. How the physicality of play, and I guess in online play, some of these things are transferred. How that physicality is something that can drive kind of learning, and I felt like I was kind of learning by making my model and talking through. I was developing my understanding and kind of explaining my thinking by doing so, and that enables people to kind of ground their thinking rather than making it much more kind of abstract. And I think that's very powerful too. And I think this operates both in the online and in the physical space when we have students in classrooms. So I thought one of the modules that I have at Lincoln is called Teaching History, which ran for the first time last year, which is really about introducing students in a very minor way to teaching, and whether that's school teaching or other elements of kind of education they might want to get into. One of the exercises we did last year was I got them to make Lego models of what it was like to be taught online during the pandemic. And this is the lecturer kind of coming out of the screen at the student who's kind of sat there. This is one of the less disturbing models that was made by my students. Many of them had the students lying down, heads and limbs removed, really emphasizing the challenges of kind of teaching and learning online. But let's try and move beyond that. What I would like you to do now is to kind of, let's go back to the chat and have a think about what are some of the opportunities or challenges we might face if we try to do the kind of pedagogic work of getting students creating in online spaces in history. What might be some of the potential and some of the scary bits? Again, we'll just spend a minute or two doing that. Panic, yes, because it's unfamiliar. Yeah, you've got the equity issue, access to tech, access to Wi-Fi, access to a space to work off campus. Lack of expertise of everyone, really. Gaps and distance, yeah. That you can't see them, you can't be with them. That's really a challenge. Not all are able to access it for a variety of reasons. Low tolerance of risk taking. Anyone want to shift towards the more positive side? Are there any things that could be like, good for the students or good for their experience and learning? Yeah, the low tolerance of risk taking, I think, from everybody is a real challenge in that regard, of students, staff. If you're the staff member who's doing it, low tolerance of risk taking potentially from the administration or your own colleagues even. They can work at their own pace, engage students as creators rather than as hard drives, so as sort of repositories, I guess. It's good because it gives them experience for the modern world. It can lead to kind of an enduring resource that isn't lost after one course. Students can kind of have a bit of control potentially. Students can own it. Can engage with complicated ideas quickly and in the moment. So again, it potentially gives them a bit more control on some kind of level. They have something to show their families and friends. I think that's really important, and potentially, depending on what sort of piece of work it is, what sort of piece of the quality, it's something they could potentially show to potential employers as well. Yeah, they can share and see each other's materials. So there's that. It's not siloed within the sort of individual student teacher relationship. It's potentially more dispersed. Okay, there's some really good perspectives there, and stuff that I hadn't even thought of. Cath has had students get jobs in museums off the back of their online work, so it does actually potentially have an impact in the world beyond the fact it's just online. Great. Right, let's move on. That's the last activity, so you can relax now. Share. Right, we're going to have to scroll through because it's... Okay, so I'm going to talk to you briefly about, because in a way the online projects that I've done aren't really the important thing. They're not really what I want to talk about now. What I want to talk about is what the students say they took away from them, or what I think I can observe the students having taken away from them. So a large project I did when I first arrived in Lincoln many years ago was called Making Digital History, and this asked students to use an online authoring tool which still exists called Xerti, which is a learning design tool, and you can see an example of at least what it used to look like on the screen there. They had to make digital objects to share what they'd learned in their learning across a range of different modules, and different colleagues did it in different ways, but most of us were using it to kind of do things like get them to talk about present a primary source to a kind of imaginary public audience, or to some kind of public audience. Yeah. We tried it as an individual activity and group projects. Sometimes we made the students do it as part of the assessment, and sometimes they could choose it amongst a suite of other things, some of which might be more traditional. The one thing we did was when students were using this tool, they were all assessed. And obviously it raised a number of challenges around stuff like using a new technology, the things that we might expect to happen offline learning or analog learning were transferred online around group work when we were asking students to do group work projects. Things like the level of the work sometimes wasn't what we were hoping it would be, things like that. So some challenges associated with the technology and some challenges associated with just teaching in general that I would have expected of anything that I was trying to do. So the exercise was a making exercise. It was around making these kind of learning objects that students could create for public audiences that would involve them, the audience clicking through. So they had to kind of put themselves in the position of somebody who's trying to teach something to a non-expert. And what we did was we ran a number of surveys with these students, asking them to tell us about the sorts of skills that they developed. And some of those surveys really did try and focus on creativity. There were like several hundred students doing this. So in terms of quantitative responses, we got students saying that they learned around stuff around working in groups. It helped with things like developing their subject knowledge because they were kind of having to process stuff and think about how they present it to others. And it helped with things like them thinking about what they were producing and how that could be presented in interesting ways to the audiences they were trying to engage, how to make things interactive, for instance, rather than just having a kind of walk through PowerPoint equivalent of a PowerPoint presentation. When we looked at the qualitative responses from these various surveys we did, it was interesting because there was much less focus on skill building, and quite a lot of like the negative qualitative responses were around the problems with group work, for instance. They were broadly positive about social aspects beyond the group work issue. So they liked the fact that it had got each other together. They were getting to know each other. They were working together on an online object, but frequently they would get together in physical spaces. And what they overwhelmingly positively talked about was this aspect of kind of producing historical knowledge for themselves collectively for a kind of audience beyond the university. That was kind of weighted really, really positively when we were kind of looking at the qualitative responses. And that's where I think we're getting at stuff around creativity, perhaps. And when we kind of broke that down, what they were actually saying within that kind of category of responses, they liked the fact that it was different, so it wasn't an essay. They liked the fact that these exercises were open, so they had choice, and they were allowed to specialize in things they were actually interested in rather than what we thought they should be interested in. They liked engaging in research into sources, and they liked that opportunity to present things in novel and interesting ways. So here's a couple of emblematic quotations. I liked being able to choose what I was going to do. I liked being able to choose the direction I took it in rather than being told what I have to do and where I have to take it. So there's something around agency there as well, I think. So that was on the kind of macro level. And really, as I was preparing the talk, I was thinking around, but it also, I think we do see creativity or like creative acts are happening not just on a curriculum level or in a module or within an assessment on a module, but in many ways students are engaging in creative acts or quasi creative acts all the time on a kind of much smaller level. One way I've got some kind of insight into this is work I've done encouraging students to kind of add annotations to readings, to choose readings for themselves and annotate them for themselves. And particularly to do things like devise their own questions based on what they've been reading rather than answering questions that I've set for them. And I think these are generative, creative, cognitive acts. They're things in which the students are coming up with thoughts and ideas that are new for themselves. They might not be new for me, but sometimes they are, around what they're reading. I don't see how that isn't a kind of creative act. And I think that relates to what Brandon was talking about around critical thinking and creativity being linked, and a point that was made by somebody who I can't remember around problem solving and creativity. I think all of these things relate on a micro level as well as on the macro level of the assessment and the curriculum. This isn't something I've had any time to do any research on whatsoever, but these are a couple of quotes from stuff I've collected around these kind of smaller activities, which I think demonstrate these sorts of activities changing how students think about their position, their position as their self-authorship, really. So I think particularly that one about where you get students to repeatedly ask their own questions, it changes their perception of who gets to ask the question and what a question is in many ways. Okay, so some more perspectives on creativity, because I don't want to eat into discussion time. When we asked students what is creativity, we got interesting responses. They're very much a focus, which I think will be interesting to discuss, and really focus on it being an individual thing, even for students who'd been doing what I would consider to have been creative work, making these objects online. They located creativity as something that was individual. And there was a real focus on it being something that's different, original, novel. So sort of the idea that it's about thinking outside the box was really, really important. I'm just going to mute myself because I really need to cough. Right, I'm back. So there's some quotes kind of illustrating that. We also asked students whether they thought that creativity could be taught, and it's really interesting. We got divergent responses here. Either you're creative or you're not. You can't be taught it. It's just a kind of fundamental state of someone's being. They can't alter it. But some other quotations that I think show a more realistic and subtle understanding of what creativity might be in practice. Maybe you need to have some kind of knack for it or an interest in it, but you can develop it to some extent. Or it can be helped and encouraged. It's something that can be cultivated. And I think this sort of spectrum probably reflects the spectrum that we'd see if we asked history lecturers about that same question. I'm not sure the percentages that would fall in each of those categories, but I think you would see a real spectrum. This is really just one of the ways that me and my colleagues at Salford Business School have found useful thinking through creativity, which is sort of stolen really from someone else's work. This idea of the division between the person, the process, and the product, like the extent to which the creativity is inherent in the person, or it's inherent in the process, or is it inherent in or is it a sort of quality of the product that they come up with, or is it something to do with all of those? And even as I've been talking now and listening to what Brandon had to say before, I think person is probably not quite right, because I think it sort of directs it into the individual and a little bit away from the potential for kind of collective creativity. So maybe people would be better. We asked students, were you creative in the objects that you made? How were you creative? Can you explain it? So with that thing about thinking outside the box, thinking about an audience in interesting ways, made me think about different ways and methods I could use to support and enhance other work. Allowed me to think in other formats than just an essay, and made me think more about presentation. So I think these are interesting things, which is getting around to something else I want to talk about. But we also did a little survey of some of the staff who'd been engaged in these modules. And some of the feedback that they gave really aligned with what the students were saying. they thought that it helped some students to think more about presentation and kind of engagement with an audience beyond that kind of teacher-student relationship. There's a real focus on kind of product as well, in both what the students have to say and what the staff have to say about the kind of idea of the output. And also that for some it kind of spurred them on to create other things that they could include in the objects that they were making. So it became more of a kind of part of a bigger creative enterprise. And it helped them to think about problems from unfamiliar angles, and that idea of unfamiliarity seems to be something that's important too. So novelty and unfamiliarity being kind of two sides of the same coin, perhaps. So this is my penultimate slide before I do some conclusions. I think one of the things that I've talked about and I've been thinking about is that the way in which the activity was set up, and some of the other creative things that I've tried to get the students to do that are offline. I think stuff that asks students to present the outcome of their work either in person or virtually to an audience other than their tutor can be really, really powerful. And I think it can be really effective in terms of motivating them. And that audience can be the public, clients, if you want to set it up that way. A number of my colleagues do sort of like mock museum kind of exhibitions, things like, or panels, or even just to other students on the module. Making that what they've done explicit can be a really powerful way of kind of driving learning and upping quality. And it's a kind of form of peer pressure that's going on because peers and others can potentially see the work. I think that in general, more effort and care goes into producing it and thinking about the audience. Obviously, there are challenges around how you scaffold that and support students who aren't comfortable with doing that sort of thing. But there are disciplines in every university that for which this is absolutely fundamental. So there are models out there for us to learn from. So just a couple of reflections. What I've tried to outline is kind of creative. These are creative activities and assessments that that were set up as open and student-led rather than teacher-driven, but they're quite traditional, really. It's about engaging with sources and telling people about them. So that the challenge for the online side of it is really scaffolding and supporting them. But I think all of it transfers offline too. I think the challenge really is thinking about how you cultivate creativity across the curriculum at different levels, and giving students opportunity to engage with it beyond the one or two people who might be actively engaging it in any department. Some of my colleagues talk about these types of creative exercises kind of activating different demographics, different types of students engaging than perhaps engage with normal, in inverted commas, assessments. And just some points as well. I think one of the challenges with online learning, but now and in the past, but also with things like creativity or any kind of pedagogic innovation is that really relates to that thing of cultivating creativity across the curriculum. There is a real risk that you get seen as the person that does funky exercises with the students, and that kind of lets everyone else off thinking about these sorts of issues, whether it's creativity or whether it's getting students to take control of their own learning in other different ways. The other two suggestions are really that I've learned so much by doing little bits of reading and Googling really about what's going on in the creative disciplines. There's a real place to learn, as Cath was saying, about how to do this, and about things like assessment rubrics and all the pedantic questions that people who might be not as into doing creative stuff will ask you. You can find the answers to those questions without making them up for yourselves. Finally, I haven't had time to read any of this, but there's loads of stuff on, well, there's loads more stuff on creativity and history in primary education in particular, and secondary education too. So again, that's another source of information that I'm going to be looking into, because I think it's potentially very, very powerful to translate some of those pedagogic techniques into what we're trying to do. So I hope that I didn't go on for too long, and I'm going to stop now, and hopefully there'll be some questions and stuff.
Thank you, Jamie. That was really interesting. So I just wondered if I could open the floor to anybody who would like to ask a question. You can either unmute yourself or alternatively put your question in the chat function. I really liked how you kind of spoke to this kind of like idea that actually we're already doing creativity, but it might be about shifting who the audience is, and that kind of maybe disrupts kind of how we can think about the creative process. I see that Katie has a question, if you'd like to.
Hiya. I
Hi.
was really interested in what you said about creativity and the students thinking of it as like an individual kind of original thing.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you face any issues or how we manage the fact that sometimes these like creative assessments, we put them in group work. And I wondered if that's an issue that was encountered at all, how we can, how we deal with that when they're in groups. Does that kind of stifle their originality or their sort of individuality?
Yeah, and I think that might be an issue that pertains beyond creativity. That the challenge of group work is, we don't, and also we, thinking about how we might teach them to do group work itself before we ask them to engage in it is like a really, but also how, yeah, and I think this relates to what I was saying towards the end around how do you do it if you're the only person doing it, or there's only two of you in a department doing this sort of stuff? Because ideally what you'd want to do is to be able to introduce the students to it and then develop it, and then maybe they have a semester where they don't do it, but then they can choose it as an option in second year and third year. So how do you kind of scaffold all of that and build that into the curriculum, which would involve stuff like, well, let's give them a little taster of it in first year in individually, and then allow them to do it in a group project in second year or something. The other thing I would say is, I think possibly, I don't know if it was a mistake, but one of the things we did was insist on assessment, and I think coupling assessment with group work for early in a degree can sometimes create some problems if you're not supporting it properly. And I'm not sure that we were. Over time I think we did, but I'm not sure we did at the start. So I think, again, maybe what you want is a kind of low stakes opportunity to engage in unassessed creative group work, to just kind of have a go and see if they like it or not. Because I think the flip side of many of them disliking the group work was that many of them also like the opportunity to be socialized with one another. And we were doing it with cohorts of 150 first year students in their first semester. So it potentially had quite a powerful potential at that moment as a socializing activity, but perhaps assigning assessment to it made it be a bit too stressful for them or something. I don't know. But so those are just some thoughts.
Thank you.
Ross. You're currently on mute.
Sorry, it's basic errors in working with technology. I'm coming at this as somebody who teaches drama, so I'm just curious. Actually, I don't know in terms of looking at people here, how many are coming at this as historians, and how much we are starting to have conversations with each other, rather than thinking about notions sometimes of reinventing a wheel. We do like lots of creative group work. So probably some of the questions and problems and solutions may well come from talking to other people. I'm just starting on a second project with David Clampin at John Moores, trying to dramatise some history, which kind of interestingly is a piece of history, and I'm not going to go into it, that actually is using creativity to solve a historical problem, actually a practical problem for people. And I'm thinking about how we haven't really thought about how we shift some of the drama skills actually into working with history students as opposed to just using history students to do the research and give it to us to be creative with. So I think there's lots of potential, and
Yeah.
some of it is about those conversations.
I think so, absolutely. I think drawing on the expertise of colleagues in other disciplines who might be more familiar with doing this kind of these sorts of assessments or processes is useful. And I think it is also a way of even if you're not engaged in what sounds like a really good project that I'd like to hear more about, and that can overcome resistance that might come potentially, I'm only just guessing, from certain, you could say, well, actually elsewhere in the institution this is absolutely standard practice, this is how you manage this sort of process, this is how you assess this sort of process. I've done some work in modifying it to meet our specific context, but I think that's a way of kind of helping to get around some barriers that might exist potentially. And it's really, and I've just found it so interesting, and it's a creative process to talk to people from other disciplines about how they do stuff. That's really, and a sort of pedagogically creative, I think, and it helps you to question your own, so many of your own assumptions.
So we have Cath next, and then David Clampett. So
yeah, so just jumping off that, my most productive conversations I've had with colleagues recently have been in design. And I realised that their whole thing is about the process and understanding the sort of problem solving process, but they were also thinking about Derby's heritage and stuff like that, and I realised that it wasn't just about me providing the historical context or whatever, but actually a collaborative process in which students could properly work together and learn off each other. So that's still a work in progress, but I would definitely say to people, go and speak to people who are doing similar stuff, but from different disciplines. The other thing I was going to say is the group work thing. I think Jamie's absolutely right that it's easier if you are part of a degree where that is scaffolded all the way through. The one thing that I would say is for my third year module, where they do an online exhibition, they work in groups in the sense that they are all assigned a theme. They're assigned a theme in a group, but then they choose their own sources and sort of bring their own individual parts within that. So it allows them to be sort of to have that individual creative sense, but they also have to collaborate with one another so that the whole exhibition section works as a whole as well. So they have some autonomy, but they also have to talk to others, and that's actually been quite good because I don't give them all the same mark. They have a reflection as well, so I can sort of adjust the marks based on their individual side, and that they like that. And the way that I tell them is that that's how it works in the world. You work in a group with people, you don't all get the same reward necessarily, but you work together in order for a larger goal, and they tend to actually quite like that. So I'm not sure it's a complete solution, but it's possibly something to think about. A sort of, there's no either or, that it has to be entirely group or entirely individual. And I'll stop talking.
No, I think that sounds like a really cleverly sort of like designed way of structuring it so that you get the benefits of both worlds. Yeah, that sounds really good. And I my only worry about letting students work with, if we let them loose, if they see how good the rooms are that every other discipline has, will look really bad, because you go into like a design studio, it's so cool, and like it's a space you actually want to be in. Anyway, sorry.
David, and we've got one last question after David.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback, as you might imagine, off what Ros was saying there. I need to declare, first of all, I'm chair of the LGMU Drama Fan Club, so just getting that out there. Yeah, and I think, Jamie, well, first off, Jamie, fantastic presentation, really inspiring, and in some ways affirming some of the stuff that we sort of mess around with and think, this is crazy. But yeah, I think the beauty with working with collaborators is that it gets over, you're saying getting over and getting around barriers, and it absolutely helps you to do that. And I think that the challenge for our students often is that they're trying to look for the right answer. And you know, they can't see beyond the established history. So the project that Ros referred to, the first project we did stupidly out on Formby Beach in late October, yeah, some history students did some background research, and I had preconceived ideas of what I thought the story was going to be. We handed over everything to the drama students, and they pulled out something that I hadn't even seen, and nor had the students. And I think that really shifts you on your axis and really gets you to see things in different day. So this is just a bit of showboating, really, I guess, on our part. But yeah, just speak to other people. I think, and people far removed from history is great in many ways, but I probably should park that there.
Well, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because like modules are so designed for one program, aren't they? Like we might need to be slightly more ambitious around cross-disciplinary modules, particularly to utilize these like different skills and to develop them for students. Yeah, Jenny, sorry.
All right, hello. I just wish that I'd had that comment about, you know, this is standard practice in other departments across institutions at the point where I was trying to get my podcast assessment through the education committee in the department, when it got thrown back because I was told that an individual student could do a 15-minute podcast the night before it was handed in, and it would, so it didn't need the you know, I couldn't give it the weighting that I given it. It needed more to it than that. And I just wanted to scream. But I was thinking sort of more broadly, particularly with Lucy's assessments, where you've got all those amazing creative things coming in. How do you go about ensuring equality of access to it, especially given how much people might have to spend in order to make the sorts of things that they're producing? And I'm really thinking sort of over the next 12 months or so, with the cost of living going up so much, I'd love to do something like that, but I've always kind of rowed back slightly because I don't want to put the onus on the students to have to provide the materials and pay for it. And of course, the flip side of that is if you want the department to pay for it, how do you persuade them to do it?
Yeah, actually, this is a question that I've only recently been kind of thinking about, because there was that document that came out, wasn't it? I can't remember who did it. I want to say Will someone, but that might have been completely wrong.
Yeah, Dave Hitchcock.
Yeah, Dave Hitchcock, his document about EDI. Yeah, I think there is an issue about kind of equality of what people are submitting. But I was probably really bad because I showed the more creative objects that are physical, and there are actually probably increasingly more things that are submitted that are digital. And so I get a lot more like PowerPoints, but they're not like standard PowerPoints that you'd have for presentations. They're more interactive, and a lot more of the kind of physical stuff. So I still get newspapers made through WordPress and ideas of that. And actually, when I moved, what the pandemic did push was the idea that actually more digital outputs were being created and sort of submitted. But yeah, no, it's something I'm increasingly quite concerned about, particularly because, like you say, with the cost of living crisis, and whether or not I need to start collecting sort of certain objects as students can like take things from myself. I haven't ever had it raised. Cost has never been raised before. So the students themselves don't necessarily frame their creative assessments around the cost factor. In fact, it seems that the value comes from it not being an economic cost. And so a lot of my students talk about the value around well-being and mental enhancement, and overwhelmingly it's been about positivity rather than concerns about how much it's costing to produce. Because for a lot of students, what they're doing is they're using perhaps material they already had. So I had someone make a dress, and they already had the fabric and the material. So yeah, No, that's a very rambling question. Something that I'm still pondering and can't sort of think
Can
about.
I just add something to that as well? I think related to that, what I found was that you've discover like surprising things about the students that they're into, or that they have skills that are not they're not skills that they've developed as part of the degree, but you find out actually some students are amazingly good at coding or something like that you just didn't know. And evidently Lucy's found similar things around, I don't know, but around things that her students might be interested in, or skills that they have that aren't, that it's just really interesting. And I mean, why shouldn't we be kind of allowing them to get some credit for that, or some, if they want to?
I'm absolutely all for it. I just don't want to create a situation, and I'm not sure. I mean, far be it from me to criticise it. Clearly, it's working really well, but I'm not sure they ever would come and raise the cost with us. I'm just not sure they'd actually say anything. They'd just go down a different route. But no, I mean, I do think the whole thing is fabulous, and I have some very creative stuff, but very little of it assessed, and most of it done within the classroom with me providing the stuff, so that the onus isn't on them. But I mean, yeah, it was just curiosity really, and the material history stuff. I went to a material history presentation earlier in the summer from Manchester, actually. So students at Manchester were doing things like cheese making and perfume making in the classroom, and I asked where the finance came for that, because clearly the students aren't paying for those materials, the university is. And yes, they did say they'd had to apply for funding. There was no guarantee that it would continue, which again, it makes it quite difficult, but they're all things that I would, now that I have a foot in the door and I have a position that I can, a permanent position that I can use to develop what I'm doing, they are things that I want to look into. So it's well timed for me, this.
Thank you very much. I've just actually noticed the time, so I'm really I'm conscious that this is now at the end of the 2 hours, and that I was really worried that we weren't going to fill it. So the fact that we've had some really great conversations. I don't know if anyone wants to ask a question of Brandon and Jamie, or alternatively, if you kind of want to leave. But because I know that some people probably have meetings to get to. It's also, I just want to kind of say as well, you probably noticed that Josh has been in sort of drawing the images around the papers, and I will be disseminating these on Twitter. So do follow me at Lucy Jones 83, and you'll be able to see them. And I'll also be putting a recording up as well. So I don't know if anyone wants to ask a question of both people, or alternatively we could do a virtual or real life clap if people want to unmute themselves.
Go on then, Lucy.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you to everyone.
Yeah, and this was a really great session to really kickstart, I think, what's going to be a really productive and thoughtful kind of workshops on creative history over the next couple of months. Keep an eye on my Twitter account. I will be announcing, hopefully, the inclusivity, queer and gender session sooner rather than later. But thank you very much to Brandon and Jamie. It's been really fabulous, and I've got so many thoughts now running through my brain. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
I'll hang around as long as people want. I just have to get to class by noon. So 2 hours, that's more than enough time.
So,
I just wanted to give a shout out, Lucy, to say I've basically used your Twitter, blogs, everything to work out how I'm going to do my classes, and they're going really well.
Thank you so much. That's really great to hear.
I'm loving being back to teaching.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah, no, teaching is great. It's great, stimulating and energizing in a nice way.
It's been a 10-year break, so so all right, see you in the next one.
See you soon, Vicky.
Bye.
Is it really easy to download the chat function?
It should be. I'll work it out. This is creativity in action, this is.
I think, oh, let me just stop recording actually.